Earlier this year in July, South Africa faced calamity in the form of looting and civil disobedience. And if we look at this calamity through the lens of Surah Yusuf, we'll come to realize that some of the challenges that we experienced, Surah Yusuf and the method in which Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam dealt with a challenge during his time, these same methodologies can serve as a solution in our time. So our calamity affected parts of KZN and parts of Gauteng. Our calamity lasted for less than 2 weeks. Yusuf alayhi salam's calamity in the form of drought and a famine lasted for 7 years long, and it affected all of Egypt as well as Palestine right up till Canaan and other neighboring countries, so the gravity of which was much greater. But certain methodologies that he implemented would have assisted us in overcoming certain challenges that we had experienced during the looting in July. The first challenge that we faced is we faced a state of unpreparedness. Now let's look at our circumstances. In February already, the president made it clear that he's unwilling to stand before the Zondo Commission, and he even made it clear that he's willing to go to prison, but he won't stand before the Zondo Commission. Then on the 29th of June, he was sentenced for contempt of court to 15 months in prison. And then eventually, only on the 7th of July was the president eventually imprisoned and arrested. My point being, there was a notice period. There was warning signs that chaos is about to flare up. We know the history of what had transpired when the Zulus stood up in 1994. We know about the chaos in the 1940s as well. So we know the history of South Africa. We know that chaos and anarchy and looting has happened in the past in South Africa. These are signs to warn us that these threats are imminent. Now if you look at Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, when the king had seen a dream, and this was brought to the attention of Yusuf alayhi salam, Yusuf alayhi salam was able to identify the threat clearly. And after identifying the threat, he was able to implement a clear plan. So he said, قَالَ تَزْرَعُونَ سَبْعَ سِنِينَ دَأَبًا. First we will experience 7 years of abundance, 7 years where you should farm enough that would support you for the next 7 years. Then he said, ثُمَّ يَأْتِي مِن بَعْدِ ذَلِكَ سَبْعٌ شِدَادٌ. Thereafter you will experience 7 years of famine and 7 years where there will be a scarcity of resources. So Yusuf alayhi salam was able to identify the threat at a distance, but as soon as he identified the threat, he was able to roll out and implement a very clear plan that would assist them through the crisis. The other challenge that we faced was food security. And some would say that in our circumstances, there was no shortage of resources, so we need to compare apples with apples. No, but if we get into this example of Yusuf alayhi salam, we'll come to realize that there was also a direct threat on the resources that Yusuf alayhi salam had accumulated. So in our situation, 16 billion rands worth of stock and equipment was completely lost and destroyed. 353,000 tons of sugar was actually destroyed. So what happened in the case of Yusuf alayhi salam? Yusuf alayhi salam was now storing resources, but he came up with a very, very clear plan in order to preserve the resources, to make sure the resources are not compromised in its security. فَمَا حَسَدْتُمْ فَذَرُوهُ فِي سُنْبُلِهِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مِمَّا تَأْكُلُونَ. He said, make sure that you keep the corn in its ears. Why was the corn to be kept in its ears? To extend its shelf life, to make sure that it's not affected by bacteria. So even though the threat to the food may be different in these two circumstances, both shared one common feature, was that there was some threat on the safety of the food, and Yusuf alayhi salam came with a clear plan, saying keep the corn in its ears, keep it in its ears to ensure that you extend the shelf life, to ensure that it's not affected by bacteria, and ensure that the food remains safe. So the next challenge that we experienced in the looting, and we experienced in COVID-19 as well, was that people resorted to panic buying and stockpiling. Social media messages went across the various platforms, and the news outlets spoke about what was transpiring in KZN. So people in Gauteng and other parts of the country resorted to stockpiling and panic buying. There were stores where the shelves were completely emptied out. Filling stations were short of fuel. Now this seriously took an impact on the supply chain, and this was one of the challenges that we had faced. How did Yusuf alayhi salam deal with this challenge? Yusuf alayhi salam had stipulated during the 7 years of famine, he regulated the amount of resources that each person is entitled to. Yusuf alayhi salam made sure that each person receives 1 camel load of grain. That would mean sufficient to assist the person, but not in excess that it would cause other people to be deprived. So he regulated the amount of resources every person could obtain to ensure that it eradicates stockpiling and panic buying. Each person received 1 camel load of grain. The next challenge that we faced was glaring in our faces, and it was a very concerning challenge. That during the time of the crisis, essential food items, the prices of which were inflated in an exorbitant way. So you came across a post where a loaf of bread was 60 rand. Others that said the loaf of bread is 80 rand. I even came across a price tag attached to a loaf of bread of 150 rand. So essential food items became exorbitant and these prices were inflated. Perhaps in some circumstances it could be justified because the logistical prices and the logistical costs had increased, but in most cases this can't be justified. Yusuf alayhi salam dealt with this challenge as well. Yusuf alayhi salam made sure that the residents of Egypt received their relief at no cost. Perhaps that could have been because they were the contributors to the accumulation of relief. But all those from neighboring countries who were coming as refugees, who were coming to seek aid, he had given them aid at a nominal reduced rate. Now, he didn't give it for free because that wouldn't be sustainable over a 7-year period, but he reduced the rate to a nominal reduced rate, and at that rate he sold it to the people of the neighboring countries in order to ensure that there's no inflation and in order to ensure that people are not exploited at the time of crisis. And finally, even the most grand of plans, if it doesn't have the right individuals executing the plan, then this greatest of plans can be a complete disaster. Yusuf alayhi salam, after identifying the threat, after recommending a plan, he made a bold statement. He said, "Ij'alni ala khaza'in al-ard." Appoint me as in charge of the resources of the land, which tells us at a time of crisis, one of the key ingredients that you require is incompetent people should step aside and competent people should occupy those spaces. He said, appoint me as in charge of the resources of the land. And then he went on to explain why he is competent. And this will serve for us as a guidelines to understand who is competent leadership. He said, Inni hafidun. Certainly I am a trustworthy person. This is the first quality that makes me competent. Inni hafidun. I am a trustworthy person. Alim. I am a person who has knowledge, and that's what makes me competent. He had knowledge of divine sciences, but what was required in addition to that? What was required was he needed to have knowledge of agriculture. He needed to have knowledge of money management. He needed to have knowledge of the psychology of people. And that's what made him competent in addition to his knowledge of divine sciences. Then Yusuf alayhi salam, a very important point was raised regarding competence, is when he was summoned from the prison. He told the messenger who came to summon him, Irji' ila rabbik. Return to your king. فَاسْأَلْهُ مَا بَالُ النِّسْوَةِ اللَّاتِي قَطَّعْنَ أَيْدِيَهُنَّ. Ask him to find out what is the condition of those ladies who cut their hands. Meaning, tell him to do an investigation regarding the accusations that led me into prison. Because remember, Yusuf alayhi salam did not have the opportunity to stay in trial. So he said, ensure that my credibility is restored. Do an investigation. Let my name be clear. Let my credibility be restored so that the populace have faith in me. The people who I lead have faith in me. And only then will I emerge from prison. So what were the 3 ingredients of competence that Yusuf alayhi salam mentioned? Inni hafidun. Certainly I am trustworthy. And that's the first ingredient for competence. Alim. I have knowledge that is required for this particular assignment. And thirdly, my credibility needs to be restored in order for me to be competent to lead in this particular office.